The shelter buzzed with its usual quiet hum of activity, the rustling of papers, the soft yips of puppies, the occasional bark that echoed through the tiled walls. Outside, the morning was brisk, leaves tumbling in golden swirls, a promise of winter's approach in the chill of the air. Alina pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, glancing out the window as the first visitors of the day approached. A family. She could tell by the small figure holding tightly to a woman's hand. Families were common here, especially around this time of year. The holidays brought with them the idea of warmth, joy, and for some, the perfect new companion. Alina let out a small sigh. Perfect was a word she struggled with. She glanced back toward the row of cages that lined the shelter walls, her eyes landing on Rufus's cage. He sat curled in the corner, his wiry fur unkempt, his bad leg tucked awkwardly under his body. His eyes, a soft amber, seemed to carry the weight of understanding that Alina both admired and pitied. He knew. Rufus always seemed to know when someone walked past, their gaze lingering just long enough to notice his limp before moving on. "Morning, Rufus," she said softly as she passed, her keys jingling in her hand. Rufus lifted his head, ears twitching, at the sound of her voice, but he didn't move. He rarely did unless he had to. The bell over the door chimed and Alina straightened, pushing her thoughts aside. The family entered, bringing with them a burst of cold air and the faint scent of damp leaves. The mother, a woman with kind eyes and a tightly wrapped coat, smiled as she approached. "Hi, we're looking for a dog," she said, her voice polite but firm. Beside her, a man stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze wandering around the room. The boy, though, he was different. Alina's eyes softened as she looked at him. He was small, his head barely reaching his mother's hip, and his oversized, yellow scarf seemed to engulf his tiny frame. His eyes, wide and curious, scanned the room with an intensity that caught her off guard. There was something in his expression that felt old, wiser than his years, perhaps. She couldn't quite place it. "Of course," Alina said, stepping from behind the counter. "We have plenty of wonderful dogs. Do you have a specific type in mind?" The mother glanced down at her son. "Something gentle," she said after a pause. "Good with children." Alina nodded, leading them toward the first row of cages. The dogs, sensing the presence of potential adopters, perked up immediately. Tails wagged, paws scratched at the bars, and a chorus of barks and whines filled the air. Alina pointed out a few options, a sprightly terrier, a calm retriever mix, but the boy didn't seem interested. He trailed behind, his small hand clutching the edge of his scarf, his gaze wandering. The parents were busy discussing the merits of one particularly energetic puppy when the boy stopped abruptly. He had wandered farther down the row, away from the lively dogs, and found himself in front of Rufus's cage. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. Alina turned, her heart sinking slightly as she saw where he was pointing. She hesitated before answering. "That's Rufus," she said, walking over to join him. "He's been with us for a while." The boy tilted his head, studying the dog with a quiet intensity. "Why?" "Well..." Alina hesitated again. How could she explain this to a child? "Rufus is special. He had an accident a long time ago and his leg didn't heal the way it should have. He's a little different from the other dogs." The boy didn't respond right away. Instead, he knelt down, his small fingers wrapping around the bars of the cage. Rufus lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto the boy's. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, Rufus pushed himself to his feet, his movements awkward but deliberate. He hobbled closer to the bars, his nose twitching as he sniffed. The air. The boy reached out, his hand hovering just inches from the cage. "Can I pet him?" he asked, looking up at Alina. She hesitated. "He's friendly," she said finally. "But he's not the kind of dog most people look for. He's not very playful, and he needs extra care." "I like him," the boy said simply. Alina blinked, surprised by the conviction in his voice. Behind them, the parents had noticed their son's absence and hurried over. The mother placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Sweetheart, he's not very healthy," she said carefully. "We should find a dog you can play with." The boy shook his head, his eyes never leaving Rufus. "But he needs me," he whispered. His voice was so soft that Alina almost didn't hear him, but the words hit her like a punch to the chest. She knelt beside him, her gaze level with his. "Why do you say that?" she asked gently. The boy hesitated, glancing down at the scarf in his hands. Slowly he unwrapped it, revealing the scar that ran from his neck to his collarbone. It was thick and jagged, the kind of mark that told a story all on its own. Alina's breath caught in her throat. "The kids at school don't talk to me," the boy said, his voice trembling. "They say I look scary. I know what it's like to feel different." The shelter fell silent. Even the dogs seemed to quiet, their barks fading into an almost reverent hush. Alina felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the boy, his small frame trembling with the weight of his confession. She glanced at Rufus, who had pressed his nose against the bars, his amber eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I think he just needs a friend," the boy said softly. The parents exchanged a long look. The mother's eyes were glassy, her lips pressed into a thin line, while the father looked as though he were trying to find the right words but couldn't. Finally, the father cleared his throat. "Are you sure?" he asked. The boy nodded. "I'm sure." Alina felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she watched the scene unfold. She had worked in the shelter for years, seen countless families come and go, but this was different. This was something she would remember. The adoption process was quick, the paperwork signed in record time. Rufus, who had spent years in the shelter, was let out on a new leash, his limp more pronounced in the brisk air. The boy walked beside him, his hand resting gently on Rufus's back. The yellow scarf was tied snugly around the dog's neck, a splash of brightness against his scruffy fur. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Shelter volunteers, neighbors, and passers-by who had overheard the boy's words stood in quiet awe. They watched as Rufus, the dog no one wanted, walked beside the boy, their steps uneven but perfectly in sync. The boy knelt, wrapping his arms around Rufus's neck. "You're perfect," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. And for the first time in years, Rufus wagged his tail. The drive home was quiet, the kind of stillness that carried unspoken thoughts and deep emotions. Elian sat in the back seat, his small hands resting on Rufus's wiry fur. The dog lay beside him, his head tilted just enough to glance at the boy every now and then, as if making sure he was still there. Elian's parents exchanged glances in the front seat, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and quiet admiration. Neither of them had expected their trip to the shelter to end like this. They had imagined a playful pup, one that would bound around the yard and chase after balls. Instead, they were bringing home a dog who limped, whose past was as broken as the scars Elian carried. And yet they couldn't argue with the bond they had seen form in an instant between their son and this unlikely companion. "Are you sure about this, Elian?" his mother asked, her voice soft but cautious as she turned in her seat to look at him. "Rufus might need a lot of care. He's not like the other dogs." Elian nodded without hesitation, his fingers gently tracing the edge of Rufus's ear. "I know, but he's perfect for me." The simplicity of his answer made her chest tighten. There was no doubt in his voice, no second guessing. Elian had always been a quiet child, introspective in ways that sometimes worried her. He wasn't like the other children, and that difference had only grown after the accident. But now, as she watched him with Rufus, she saw a glimmer of something she hadn't seen in a long time: hope. When they pulled into the driveway, Elian carefully unfastened his seatbelt and waited for his father to open the door. Rufus hesitated, for a moment, his movements slow and deliberate, before stepping onto the grass. The cool air ruffled his fur as he sniffed cautiously, his tail wagging in hesitant, uneven arcs. Elian knelt beside him, his arms wrapped protectively around the dog's neck. "This is your new home," he whispered. Rufus leaned into the boy's touch, his amber eyes softening. Inside, Elian led Rufus through the house, showing him every corner as if the dog could truly understand. "This is the living room," he said, gesturing toward the cozy space filled with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of cinnamon from a candle his mother had lit. "And this is my room." He pushed open the door to reveal a small, brightly lit space. The walls were covered in drawings, some of animals, some of fantastical creatures, all done in the bold strokes of a child's imagination. Rufus hobbled inside, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Elian patted the edge of his bed, inviting the dog to join him. Rufus hesitated for a moment before climbing up, his movements careful and slow. Elian sat beside him, his hand resting on the dog's back. "We're going to be best friends," he said softly. Rufus let out a low, contented sigh. The days that followed were a period of adjustment for everyone. Elian's parents watched as their son and Rufus grew closer with each passing moment. They had worried at first, unsure if Elian would be able to handle the responsibility of caring for a dog with special needs. But Elian proved them wrong. Every morning, he woke up early to feed Rufus, carefully measuring the food and making sure the dog had fresh water. He brushed Rufus's wiry fur, his small hands moving with gentle precision. And every evening he sat beside Rufus on the porch, the two of them watching the sun dip below the horizon. At school, things were still difficult for Elian. The other children noticed the scar on his neck before they noticed anything else. They whispered and pointed, their words sharp and cutting. Elian didn't say much in response. He had learned to keep his head down, to retreat into the safety of his thoughts. But now he had something to look forward to at the end of each day. He had Rufus. One afternoon, Elian came home with tears in his eyes. His mother noticed immediately, but before she could ask what was wrong, he ran to his room, slamming the door behind him. A moment later, Rufus appeared, his ears perked up as if sensing the boy's distress. He limped toward Elian's room, his movements slow but determined. Inside, Elian sat on the floor, his back against the bed, his arms wrapped around his knees. Rufus approached cautiously, lowering himself onto the floor beside the boy. Elian didn't say anything at first. He simply rested his head against the dog's side, his fingers gripping the rough fur. "They said I was a monster," Elian whispered, his voice barely audible. "They said I looked like a villain from a story." Rufus didn't move, but his presence was enough. Elian closed, his eyes, his breathing evening out as he felt the steady warmth of the dog beside him. For the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone. Word of Rufus spread quickly through the neighborhood. People were curious about the dog no one had wanted, and the boy who had chosen him. At first, the neighbors were hesitant. They saw Rufus's limp, his ragged appearance, and assumed he wouldn't amount to much. But as time passed, they began to notice something different. One afternoon, Elian and Rufus were in the park. The boy threw a small ball, watching as Rufus hobbled after it, his movements awkward but determined. A group of children nearby watched, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. One of them, a girl with a red bow in her hair, approached, cautiously. "Is that your dog?" she asked. Elian nodded, his hand resting on Rufus's back. "His name is Rufus." "He looks different," the girl said, her tone more curious than mean. "So do I," Elian replied, his voice steady. The girl hesitated before reaching out to pet Rufus. The dog sniffed her hand before leaning into her touch. She smiled. "He's nice." Elian nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. "He is." Slowly, the other children approached, their initial hesitance fading as they saw how gentle Rufus was. They threw the ball, laughed at his clumsy attempts to fetch it, and petted him with growing confidence. For the first time, Elian felt included. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden change, but it was a start. At home, Elian's parents noticed the difference. Their son, who had once been so withdrawn, was starting to come out of his shell. He talked more, shared stories about the park, and even started drawing pictures of Rufus surrounded by children. It was as if the bond he had formed with the dog was helping him rebuild the pieces of himself that had been fractured. One evening, as Elian and Rufus sat on the porch, the boy's father joined them. He lowered himself onto the step, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've been taking good care of Rufus," he said after a long pause. Elian nodded. "He takes care of me too." The simplicity of the statement caught his father off guard. He looked at his son, at the way he rested his hand on Rufus's back, and felt a pang of guilt for ever doubting their decision to adopt the dog. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Elian looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You are?" His father nodded. "It takes a lot of strength to care for someone else. You've shown me just how strong you are." A small smile spread across Elian's face, and for the first time his father saw the boy he had always known was there, hidden beneath the scars and the pain. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Rufus became more than just a dog. He became a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the healing power of unconditional love. Elian too began to heal, not just from the physical scars, but from the emotional wounds that had weighed him down for so long. In the end, it wasn't the boy who saved the dog, or the dog who saved the boy. It was both of them, finding in each other the strength to face the world one step at a time. Winter settled into the town with a quiet persistence, the air crisp and the world blanketed in soft white snow. Elian and Rufus adjusted to the cold with little fuss. The boy now donned an even thicker scarf, bright blue this time, which Rufus often tried to chew on playfully while Elian laughed and gently nudged him away. Rufus seemed livelier than he had in years. The consistent love and care he received from Elian transformed him in ways that startled even the family. His wiry coat became shinier with regular grooming, and though his limp remained, he no longer hesitated to move, to explore, to chase, after the occasional snowball Elian tossed in their yard. It was as if with every wag of his tail Rufus was saying, "I belong here." The same could be said for Elian. Though his days at school were still far from easy, the whispers and teasing from his classmates began to sting a little less. He had Rufus waiting for him every afternoon. The sight of the scruffy dog wagging his tail at the gate, as if no one else in the world mattered, was enough to lift even the darkest cloud. The bond between them was undeniable. One Saturday morning, Elian's mother entered his room to find him sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper and pencils. His face was scrunched up in concentration as he sketched. Rufus lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching the boy with an intensity that made her smile. "What are you working on?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Elian held up the paper. It was a drawing of Rufus, but not as he looked now. In the picture, Rufus wore a cape, his chest puffed out proudly like a superhero. Around him were children smiling, reaching out to pet him. Above the picture, Elian had written in neat, careful letters, "Rufus the Brave." His mother's heart swelled. "That's wonderful, Elian," she said. "Why is he the brave?" Elian shrugged, but there was a sparkle in his eyes. "Because he's not scared of being different," he said simply. She blinked back tears, her hand gently brushing his hair. "Neither are you," she whispered. As winter deepened, the bond between Rufus and Elian started to ripple beyond their small family. At school, Elian's teacher, Mrs. Callan, noticed the change in him. Where Elian had once sat silently at his desk, eyes downcast and hands folded, he now raised his hand to answer questions, his voice growing steadier with each passing week. He even began bringing small drawings of Rufus to share during show and tell. And while some of the children still whispered, others started asking questions. "Can I meet Rufus?" one boy asked one day during recess. His name was Corin, and though he was one of the quieter students in the class, he was also one of the kindest. Elian hesitated for a moment before nodding. That weekend, Corin came over. Rufus greeted him with a sniff and a wag of his tail. The boy laughed, petting the dog's scruffy fur. "He's really cool," Corin said, turning to Elian. "Even with his leg. I like him." Elian smiled, a genuine wide smile that lit up his face. It was the first time he felt someone truly understood what he saw in Rufus. From that day on, Corin and Elian became fast friends, their shared admiration for Rufus forming the foundation of their bond. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Word of Rufus's story began to spread throughout the school and even the town. The neighbors, who had initially been skeptical, now stopped to greet Rufus whenever they saw him. Some even brought treats, which Elian would accept with a shy smile and a quiet, "Thank you." Slowly but surely, the dog who had once been overlooked became a small-town celebrity. One afternoon, Elian's father came home with a surprise. He placed a large cardboard box on the kitchen table and motioned for Elian to come over. The boy's curiosity was evident as he opened the box and pulled out what was inside. "A leash?" Elian asked, holding up the bright red item. "Not just any leash," his father explained. "This is a special leash. It's reflective and sturdy, so you and Rufus can go on walks safely even in the evenings. There's more in the box." Elian dug deeper, pulling out a matching collar and a small vest. The vest was black with white letters stitched across the side. "Therapy dog in training." Elian's eyes widened. "What's this for?" His father knelt down beside him. "You've done such a great job with Rufus," he said. "We thought he might be able to help others too. There's a program in town that trains therapy dogs to visit schools, hospitals, and care homes. Rufus has a special way of making people feel better, just like he did for you." Elian looked at Rufus, who was watching the exchange with his head tilted and his tail wagging slightly. "Do you think he can do it?" Elian asked. "I think he already does," his father replied. Training sessions began the following week. Elian and Rufus attended classes at a local community center, where they met other dogs and their owners. Rufus wasn't the fastest learner, but he made up for it with his determination. Elian worked with him tirelessly, teaching him commands like sit, stay, and visit. The trainers were impressed by the bond between the two. "You've got a natural connection," one trainer said to Elian. "That's not something you can teach." By spring, Rufus had passed his certification. The day they received his official therapy dog badge, Elian couldn't stop beaming. He held the badge up proudly, showing it to anyone who would look. Rufus seemed to sense the importance of the moment, standing tall despite his limp. Their first visit was to a local care home. Elian was nervous at first, unsure of how Rufus would react. But as soon as they entered the room, Rufus's tail wagged, and he approached the nearest resident, a woman in a wheelchair, with his gentle, curious sniff. She laughed, her weathered hands reaching out to stroke his fur. "He's beautiful," she said. "What's his name?" "Rufus," Elian replied, his voice steady. "He's my best friend." The woman smiled. "I can see that." From that day on, Rufus became a regular visitor. He brought joy to everyone he met, from the elderly residents of the care home to the children at a local hospital. Elian always accompanied him, proudly holding the leash and introducing his dog with the same quiet confidence he had discovered in himself. One sunny afternoon, as Elian and Rufus walked home from the park, they passed a group of children playing on the sidewalk. One of them, a boy who had often been among Elian's tormentors, stopped and stared. "Hey, that's the dog from school," the boy said. His tone wasn't mocking this time. It was curious, even admiring. Elian hesitated but nodded. "This is Rufus." The boy stepped closer, his hands shoved into his pockets. "He's cool," he admitted. "I heard he helps people." Elian glanced at Rufus, who was sitting patiently beside him. "He does," Elian said. Then after a pause he added, "He can be your friend too if you want." The boy looked surprised but nodded. He reached out to pet Rufus, who leaned into his touch. For the first time, Elian felt the weight of the past start to lift. The seasons continued to change, and so did Elian and Rufus. They were no longer just a boy and his dog. They were a team, a symbol of resilience and hope in their small town. Rufus's limp remained, but it no longer defined him. Just as Elian's scar, though still visible, no longer defined him, they had both found their place in the world, and together, they reminded everyone they met that being different wasn't something to fear, it was something to celebrate. The town had blossomed in the warm glow of summer, its streets lined with vibrant flowers and children running freely. The sun hung in the sky like a soft promise, and Elian and Rufus had become symbols of what it meant to embrace life. Despite all the pain and struggles that came with it, every evening the two of them would stroll through the neighborhood, their shadows stretching long as they walked side by side. The sound of Rufus's claws clicking softly on the pavement was a soothing rhythm, and Elian's heart felt lighter with each step. Though the scars from his past still lingered, they no longer carried the same weight. Rufus had given him a gift no one else could, a sense of belonging not just in his family, but in the world at large. Elian's mother often watched them from the porch, her heart swelling with pride as she saw how far her son had come. She had always known that there was a quiet strength within him, but seeing it blossom alongside, Rufus was something beyond words. In the dog, Elian had found not just a companion but a teacher, a protector, and a friend who would never let him down. And Rufus had found the same in Elian. He had come to the shelter a broken dog, his body scarred and his spirit weary. But now Rufus stood tall and proud. His limp remained, but it no longer defined him. It was part of him, but it wasn't who he was. Rufus had learned to trust again, to love again. And as he walked beside Elian, his tail swaying in rhythm with the boy's steps, he knew that he had found his forever home. But just as the seasons shift, so too did life have its own way of changing. One bright morning in late summer, Elian's parents sat him down in the living room, their faces serious but gentle. "Elian," his father began, "we need to talk to you about something important." Elian's heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Rufus, who was lying beside him, the dog's head resting in his lap. Something in his parents' tone made the air feel thicker than usual. He glanced back up at them, trying to read their expressions. "Is something wrong?" Elian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, no, sweetheart," his mother said, her eyes softening. "Nothing's wrong. But we've been talking and we think it might be time for a new chapter." Elian's heart thudded in his chest. A new chapter? What did that mean? His father leaned forward, his hands folded in his lap. "There's an opportunity for us to move," he said. "To a place that has a bigger house, more space for you and Rufus to play. It's a little farther away, but it's a good opportunity." Elian felt a wave of emotions crash over him. He had never imagined leaving this town, the place where he had found his place with Rufus. He thought of the care home where they had visited so many times, the familiar faces of people who had come to rely on the quiet companionship Rufus offered. He thought of the children at school, Corin and the others who had slowly become his friends. But "I don't want to leave," Elian said, his voice trembling. His fingers tightened around Rufus's fur, the dog's presence grounding him. "What about Rufus? What about everyone?" His mother reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Elian, we're not asking you to leave everything behind. We'll still visit, and Rufus can still do his therapy work. It's just a chance for us to grow, to explore new possibilities." Elian looked at Rufus again, who was watching him with a quiet understanding in his amber eyes. He had always known that there was something special about their bond, something that went beyond simple companionship. It was as though Rufus could sense his emotions, could sense the weight of his thoughts. But now, in this moment, Elian wasn't sure what the right choice was. The idea of leaving the only home he had known, the place where he had begun to heal, was overwhelming. "Will we be happy there?" Elian asked softly. His parents exchanged a glance before his mother smiled. "We can make it work. It's not about the house or the place. It's about us being together, and Rufus being with us. We're a team, Elian. That's what matters most." Elian looked down at Rufus, who was now lying across his feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog's presence was calm and reassuring, as if he was saying, "Wherever you go, I'll go with you." Elian realized that no matter where they moved, he would still have the one constant in his life, the dog who had changed everything for him. "I think I'm ready," Elian said, his voice steady now. "If we go, I want to make sure Rufus still helps people. I want him to be a therapy dog everywhere we go." His parents smiled, relief flooding their faces. "We'll make sure that happens, Elian," his father said. "We'll make sure Rufus keeps being the brave dog he is." And so the family began their preparations to move. There was much to be done, of course. Packing, finding a new school for Elian, and saying goodbye to the people they had come to know and love. It was bittersweet. Elian said his farewells to the children in the neighborhood and the residents of the care home, each time feeling the pang of leaving behind a piece of his heart. But there was also a sense of anticipation, a feeling that this new chapter might hold something even greater than what had come before. The last day in their old house arrived, and as Elian stood at the door with Rufus by his side, he took one last look at the place that had been home. He thought of the memories, both good and painful, that had shaped him, the laughter, the tears, and the quiet moments he had shared with Rufus. "We're going to be okay," he whispered to the dog. Rufus's tail thumped against the floor in response, and Elian smiled, feeling a surge of hope. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it together. The drive to their new home was long, but it wasn't lonely. Elian sat in the back seat with Rufus, watching the world go by. The scenery changed, but the bond between him and his dog remained unchanged. It was a comfort to him, knowing that Rufus was more than just a pet. He was family. He was home. When they finally arrived at their new house, Elian was struck by the spaciousness of it. The yard was larger, the rooms more open, but despite the change in surroundings, something remained constant. Rufus at his side. Elian knelt down to give him a hug, feeling the familiar warmth of the dog's fur against his cheek. "This is our new home," Elian said. "But you and we're still the same." Rufus nuzzled against him, as if agreeing. He was still the same dog, brave, loyal, and full of love, and Elian was still the same boy, quiet, strong, and capable of more than he had ever known. In the weeks that followed, Elian and Rufus found their rhythm in the new town. Elian started at a new school, and though it was difficult at first, he soon found that the students there were kinder. They had heard about the dog who had helped so many people, and they welcomed Elian with open arms. But the most important change happened when Elian and Rufus began their therapy work in the new town. The local hospital, the care homes, and schools all welcomed them with open hearts. Rufus's presence brought joy to everyone he met, and Elian's quiet, steady companionship made people feel safe and cared for. And though Elian had left the home where he had started his healing, he had carried with him the lessons learned along the way. The importance of kindness, of not letting pain define you, and of finding strength in the most unexpected places. With Rufus at his side, Elian had become a beacon of hope, not just for others, but for himself. One day, after a particularly moving therapy session, Elian stood outside with Rufus, watching the sun set in the distance. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, the air cool but comforting. Elian felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling of quiet contentment. "Thank you, Rufus," Elian whispered, "for showing me what it means to be brave." Rufus, as always, rested, his head on Elian's lap, his eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding. Together they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. No longer just a boy and his dog, they had become something more. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always room for light, for hope, and for the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. They had found their place in the world side by side, and that was enough.